3. Description. 3.1. Introduction. World's oceans encompasses vast majority of the planet's surface, more than 70%, yet largely remain unexplored. The marine ecosystem is by far the largest ecosystem on this planet, harboring rich diversity of living organisms which play a key role in the sustenance of life on this planet. As per the CBD, biological diversity, or biodiversity, is defined as the variability among living organisms from all sources including inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species and of ecosystems. The life is believed to have originated in the ocean around 3.7 billion years ago, and much of the organic evolution happened there. It was only around 400 million years ago that the first terrestrial colonization of marine plants, and subsequently animals, begun. Although the marine biodiversity is playing a number of crucial roles for the sustenance of terrestrial organisms including us, its biodiversity largely remain inconspicuous. For example, it is estimated that more than 65% of the planet's oxygen production happen in ocean, by means of two microalgal species namely Prochlorococcus and Synechococcus, and without these two species alone, the rest of the aerobic life on this planet would be asphyxiated. These and other marine plants fix vast majority of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at the primary tropic level of the oceanic ecosystem. Carbon fixation by the marine algae acts as the natural atmospheric carbon capture mechanism, through which level of CO2 in the atmosphere had been in control for billions of years. When these surface algae, called phytoplankton, and other marine organisms die, it sinks to the ocean bed carrying the fixed carbon, which later compressed into what we refer these days as fossil fuel. Although world's major oceans are contiguous to encompass one giant system, biodiversity of which do not have such a uniform pattern. There are distinct biologically mediated habitats. 7. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Including seaweed beds, seagrass meadows and coral reef ecosystems, which has a high degree of both species richness and species evenness. 3.2. Ecosystem goods and services provided by the marine biodiversity. At the core of the topic of marine biodiversity is an understanding of why such a biodiversity matters to us. Marine biodiversity consists of all kinds of marine organisms, including acellular viruses, prokaryotes bacteria, blue-green algae, and eukaryotes protists, algae, plants, fungi and animals. The term ecosystem goods and services refers how an ecosystem is beneficial to the humanity by means of tangible goods and intangible services that it provides us. Marine biodiversity provides a number of goods, the products that are beneficial to the humanity. Marine life-based products include fisheries and other food resources including edible seaweeds, seaweed-based industrial products such as alginate, agar, carrageenan etc., pearl oysters, pharmaceutical, nutraceutical and biochemical products from the marine organisms, other industrial products from the marine organisms including paints, fertilizer, fodder, cosmetics, anti-fouling substances, glues and so on. There are a number of regulating services that the marine biodiversity provides. This include global oxygen production through phytoplankton photosynthesis, atmospheric natural carbon capture and sequestration by marine algae, nutrient recycling via a number of biogeochemical cycles. The marine biodiversity also provides cultural services that are non-material, so as other supporting services that offer no direct benefit to human beings. For example, marine aphrodite spines recently discovered to have potential applications in photon engineering, communication and biomedical engineering. Marine microbes have been recently discovered to be producing electricity that has potential applications in providing economically viable electricity in rural areas. Marine bivalve shells have been described to have potentials for developing into tougher water resistance. 8. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Ceramics for biomedical and structural engineering applications. Other intangible services that the marine biodiversity offers include the so-called warm glow services, including bequest value and existence value. Bequest value refers the public perception that the marine biodiversity is extremely important for our generations of posterity even though some of the organisms might not yet be useful to us directly, its utility remain to be discovered. Existence value refers the value accredited to the marine ecosystem just by knowing its existence. Popular media such as BBC's Blue Planet documentary series have had a tremendous impact on the people's perception of marine biodiversity such that those who have never saw a coral reef ecosystem by themselves could still be appreciative of its importance by its mere existence. It is estimated that vast majority of marine biodiversity is remain to be discovered. Some say humanity knows more about moon than our own oceans. Marine ecosystem goods and services, therefore, also includes future unknown and speculative benefits to the humanity. 3.3. Intertidal biodiversity. Arguably, the marine habitat with richest biodiversity in offing is indeed intertidal region. Intertidal region, also called eulittoral region, is the coastal area between high tide mark and low tide mark. Therefore, this area periodically gets submerged in water during high tides, while get exposed during low tides. Figure 1. 9. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Figure 1. Various zones, habitats and topological features of marine ecosystem. Above the high tide mark where the surf gets splashed is called splash zone, also called superlittoral zone, which is also included in the intertidal region. A vast majority of described seaweed species are from intertidal region. This region also support a wide variety of marine animals as well, including crabs, sea cucumber, barnacles, limpets, isopods, mussels, starfish, sea anemones and so on. Tidal range, the distance between high water mark and low water mark, defines the intertidal region. The tidal range is influenced by a number of factors including topography of coast, gravitational force of moon and so on. There is a substantial variation in the tidal range spatially and temporally. At some locations such as that in Canada and United Kingdom, tidal range could be as high as 15 meters, while most of the other coastal regions have average tidal range of about 2 meters. The tidal range is high during spring tides and low during near tides, therefore, researchers. 10. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Who work with intertidal biodiversity typically plan the expedition during spring tides to maximize their sample collection. 3.4. Neritic zone biodiversity. Continental shelf is the region beyond intertidal habitat towards open ocean where the sea is moderately shallow, before making a steep incline at the fringe of the shelf. Continental shelf ecosystem is also known as the neritic zone. The region immediately below the low water mark is called sublittoral zone, which the region of neritic zone nearest to the coast. Geographically, the continental shelf is part of the continental crust. Typical depth of this region is around 200 meters. This region is perhaps the most exploited marine habitat by the humanity for the fishery resources. The part of continental shelf that lies within 22.5 kilometers from the coast is known as territorial waters, a region that is considered to be part of the national jurisdiction of respective country, while the region including territorial waters and extending up to 280 kilometers into the sea is called exclusive economic zone. Due to the shallow nature, the neritic zone largely encompasses photic zone, where sunlight can penetrate and thereby supports primary productivity. In contrast, the abyssal plain of deep ocean, where the depth is between 3,000 meters and 6,000 meters, remains mostly a barren desert for the life. 3.5. Pelagic zone biodiversity. Pelagic zone is the water column of the open ocean beyond continental shelf. The continental shelf makes a steep incline known as continental slope towards the open ocean. The pelagic zone, with an average depth of around 2 kilometers, can be further divided into various subzones depending on the depth. The term pelagic typically refers the surface waters of the ocean where abundant biodiversity is present. The biodiversity consists of 11. Paper 03 Biodiversity and conservation. Planktonic organisms that float on the sea surface, which include phytoplanktons, planktonic plants, and zooplanktons, planktonic invertebrate animals. Phytoplanktons are the largest primary producers in the world. As stated earlier, these tiny organisms fix more than 65% of the CO2 from the atmosphere and generate vast majority of the oxygen that we breathe. Phytoplankton encompass both eukaryotic microalgae, as well as prokaryotic cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. Cyanobacterial phytoplankton, owing to its small size, is often referred to as picoplankton. The term femtoplankton refers to marine viruses. Planktons, by definition, cannot swim actively against the current. Those that can swim against the current are termed nectons. Nectinic biodiversity of pelagic zone largely consists of bony or cartilaginous fishes, mollusks such as scallops and squids, and crustaceans arthropods such as lobsters and crabs. 3.6. Benthic biodiversity. In contrast, benthic zone refers to the region at the very bottom of the open ocean, the sea at the abyssal plain. The region just above the benthic zone is called demersal zone. Both benthic and demersal zones are extremely less biodiverse region of the open ocean. However, benthic region of coastal regions have very high biodiversity. Organisms like bivalves, sponges, polychaete worms, snails, cephalopods, crustaceans, clams, crabs, etc. that live on the benthic zone is known as benthos. Benthos are mostly filter feeders, detrivores or saprophytes. Most of the benthic biodiversity remain unknown to the humanity, as deep diving equipment including manned submarines and unmanned remotely operated diving vehicles are necessary for its discovery and retrieval, and as of this writing only very few countries have such technological capabilities. Even the pelagic marine biodiversity largely remain undiscovered. For example, it was only recently that the colossal squid Mesonicotuthis hamiltoni, that can grow up to 14 meters in length, had been fully described. 12. Paper 03 Biodiversity and conservation. 3.7. Hydrothermal vent system. Although benthic biodiversity thought to be minimal and largely remains unexplored, certain regions harbors unique biodiversity. One such noteworthy ecosystem is hydrothermal vent system. Submarine hydrothermal vents often forms features known as black smokers, and consists of various chemoautotrophic and thermophilic bacteria. Hydrothermal vents are found along the edge of tectonic plates, and therefore, volcanically active locations. Several deep-diving submarine missions have discovered considerable biodiversity at a number of black smokers, including one at the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in ocean approximately 11 kilometers below the surface in Pacific Ocean. The biodiversity other than thermophilic bacteria encompass giant tube worms, limpets, clams and shrimp that depend upon the chemoautotrophic bacteria for their sustenance, a truly remarkable biodiversity found nowhere else on the planet. While the average seawater temperature at the seabed is around 2 C, temperature at these black smokers could reach as high as 465 C, owing to the extreme pressure of the water column. One of the prevailing theories explaining the origin of life on planet Earth propounds that the life originated in these submarine hydrothermal vents. 3.8. Biologically mediated marine habitats and its biodiversity. A number of highly biodiverse hotspots in the ocean are biologically mediated habitats, habitats in part constituted by the living organisms. Prominent biologically mediated habitats of the world's oceans include seaweed beds, seagrass meadows and coral reef ecosystem. These habitats serve as a breeding nursery ground for fishes and other marine animals, as a shelter for their sustenance, and as a refuge from predators. Seaweed beds, by far, is the most important amongst these biologically mediated habitats, as they form vast expanses of productive clonal forests supporting the ecological niche. Extensive submarine forests of giant kelp, the brown seaweed Macrocystis pyrifera, have been reported from cooler parts of many shallow ocean. 13. Paper 03 Biodiversity and conservation. Beds of the world. Seagrass meadows also serve as a productive biologically mediated ecosystem. Genera Zostera, Philospatix and Halophila form predominant seagrass meadows in the world. Seaweed meadow ecosystem is extremely important and support a wide variety of biodiversity for multiple reasons, as it slows down the oceanic current, it increases sedimentation, and its extensive root system and rhizome serves as a scaffold for reinforcing the seabed, ultimately helping to minimize coastal erosion. Both seaweed beds and seagrass meadows are amongst the most productive ecosystems of the ocean. It fixes CO2 into food to support higher trophic levels, and produces oxygen supporting the aerobic life. Some estimates suggest that seagrass meadows alone constitute 10% of the total oceanic carbon production, demonstrating the extraordinary ecosystem services that these ecosystems offer. Coral reef ecosystems, although an object of media glory, is comparatively less extensive although highly productive ecosystem, sometimes referred as rainforests of the sea. Coral reefs, albeit occupying less than 0.1% of the total oceanic area, support the life of more than 25% of the marine life, demonstrating its importance in marine biodiversity. The reef system is in fact symbiosis between an animal, cnidarian, related to sea anemones and jellyfish, and an algae, dinoflagellate, symbiodinium, also called zooxanthellae. The algae provide nutrients for the cnidarian, which grows and exudate calcium carbonate to support its exoskeletons, thereby bolstering the hard coral reef system. Barrier and fringe coral reefs are most abundant, while circular atoll coral reef system are common around islands, including lockatives. World's largest coral reef ecosystem is found off Queensland in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. The reef ecosystem support turf and coralline algae, multitude of tropical fish species, invertebrates including sponges, sea urchins and sea slugs, sea snakes and so on. 3.9. Global spatial patterns of marine biodiversity. Perhaps the most prominent spatial pattern of global marine biodiversity is that the most biodiverse region is off Indo-Malay archipelago, and from this place on all directions the biodiversity gradually decreases. One explanation for this apparent bizarre phenomenon is that 14. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. The Indonesian archipelago provides a richly diverse habitats that can support various living forms with extremely high phylogenetic diversity, encompassing highly evolutionarily distant species, such that the system has unusually high degree of ecological resilience, the ability to spring back to normal after major natural catastrophes. Various studies have confirmed this longitudinal pattern of global marine biodiversity. Such a clear pattern for latitudinal gradient of marine biodiversity is non-existent. In case of terrestrial biodiversity, the biodiversity decreases progressively polewards, i.e., from equator to either South Pole or North Pole, the biodiversity decreases. A similar trend of decrease in biodiversity from equator to North Pole had been documented in case of marine biodiversity. However, such an obvious pattern is non-existent in the case of southern hemisphere. Ocean in extreme southern latitudes off Antarctica is highly biodiverse and the diversity is comparable to that of the tropics. Another obvious spatial pattern is that pelagic marine biodiversity is higher at shallow coastal waters than at deep open ocean waters, as the coasts support a wide range of habitats for the multitude of life forms. One estimate conclude that while there are only 1,200 species of pelagic fish, there are around 13,000 species of coastal fish. However, the benthic biodiversity of soft sedimentary seabed tend to increase from shallow coastal region to deep sea. Another pattern is that the marine biodiversity tend to magnify in benthic zone rather than pelagic zone. The reason is thought to be due to the origination of marine fauna at the sediments of benthic region rather than in pelagic water column. 3.10. Threats to marine biodiversity. There are a number of anthropogenic threats to the global marine biodiversity. Perhaps the most serious threat are the effects of climate change. There are three major effects of climate change that affects marine biodiversity. First and foremost amongst them, albeit inconspicuous, is the phenomenon of ocean acidification. With rising atmospheric CO2 level, a substantial portion of it get mixed up with seawater and converted into carbonic acid. This result in the acidification of global oceans. Since the Industrial Revolution of 18th century, the average pH. 15. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Of world's oceans have decreased from 8.19 to 8.07. This change might look a very slight at first, but remember that pH is expressed in logarithmic scale, and a drop of 0.1 picohenries unit indicate a net acidification of 28.8%. The consequences of ocean acidification is widespread and alarming. Unicellular algae are especially vulnerable to the acidification. Algal symbionts zooxanthellae of corals dies, killing the whole coral reef ecosystem. A vast majority of coral reef ecosystems in the world have been threatened by this phenomenon, with a large number of reef systems already collapsed, a phenomenon called coral bleaching, the irrevocable death of coral reefs. Rising ocean acidity also affects phytoplanktons, the largest primary producers of the world. Another effect of climate change is rising seawater temperature. Rising water temperature has a direct effect on the survival and life history of organisms. It also leads to changes in species distribution patterns and species dispersal from warm tropics to warming polar regions. Rising seawater temperature also affects algae and algal symbionts of corals. Combined with ocean acidification, this double whammy is truly disastrous. The third consequence of climate change is rising seawater levels. Although this might not have direct implication to marine biodiversity, the seawater level rise would lead to the collapse of many fringe ecosystems, including estuaries, wetland and mangrove ecosystems, with associated loss of biodiversity. Many of the marine organisms, including a number of fish species, migrate to estuaries and riverine habitats for spawning. Overexploration of marine resources are a major threat to marine biodiversity, and this problem is especially prone to the coastal regions. Fish resources of the world is rapidly diminishing due to overexploitation and trawler fishing that indiscriminately catches bottom-dwelling key species as well as the juvenile forms of all fishes. Trawling also catches mollusks and echinoderms, adversely affecting its biodiversity. A form of fishing popular in many countries including Philippines is dynamite fishing, where a major submarine explosion kills vast number of fish altogether. However, this also decimate the entire habitat with all other life forms. Fishing using cyanide to catch the live fishes also have huge repercussions to the marine biodiversity. Other major threats to marine biodiversity include anthropogenic pollution. Major. 16. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Pollutants that affect marine biodiversity are PCBs, dioxins and heavy metals, most of which get progressively bioaccumulated to higher trophic levels. Higher nutrient load also results in algal blooms, leading to phenomenon of eutrophication. This causes hypoxia, reduced dissolved oxygen concentration, leading to the collapse of the entire ecosystem. It is estimated that 67% of world's population lives along the coast, within 60 kilometers from the coast, and a number of major cities of the world are located at the coast. This demographic pattern exerts tremendous stress to the marine biodiversity. Marine litter is a major problem in world's oceans. There are a number of massive litter islands reported in open sea around the world. Littering by microplastics is revealing itself to be a major issue, as this could get into the bodies of a number of marine organisms. Habitat loss is yet another major issue. Major civil construction projects, including dams, port and reclamations of estuaries, have implications on the marine biodiversity. Marine species invasion through ballast water has altered a number of natural environments. Examples include introduction of invasive seaweed, the killer algae, Caulerpa taxifolia into Mediterranean Sea, and the C. tenaphore Nemeopsis lygae from U.S. East Coast to Black Sea. 4. Summary. 4.1. Marine biodiversity, despite playing crucial importance in global biogeochemical cycles and nutrient fluxes, remain poorly studied. 4.2. Marine biodiversity is traditional classified according to various zones and depth profiles, including neritic, limnetic, photic, intertidal, subtidal and benthic diversity. 4.3. There are a number of biologically mediated habitats that host an extraordinary diversity of marine flora and fauna. These are seaweed beds, seagrass meadows and coral reef system. Apart from these, hydrothermal vents also has high biodiversity. 4.4. A clear longitudinal gradation in marine biodiversity is that from Indonesian archipelago in all directions, the biodiversity gradually decreases. 17. Paper O3 Biodiversity and Conservation. 4.5. Latitudinal gradation is less apparent. While diversity decreases with increasing latitudes in northern hemisphere, same is not true in southern hemisphere where tropics as well as Antarctic Ocean have comparable diversity. 4.6. In pelagic zone, coastal waters have more biodiversity than open ocean waters. However, in case of benthic zone, biodiversity increases from coast to open sea, although this pattern is less obvious. 4.7. Major threats to marine biodiversity include climate change, pollution, overexploitation, habitat loss, and species invasion. Paper O3 Biodiversity and Conservation. 3. Description. 3.1. Introduction. It is estimated that 99.9% of species ever lived on this planet have gone extinct. Of course, almost the entire extinction was natural, background, not human-mediated. In fact, our own species came to existence only very recently in the deep geological time. Global biodiversity changes both spatially as well as temporally, and an understanding about such changes would enable us to know various contributory factors, to predict the future and to derive an effective conservation measures. While there are many levels of biodiversity from macromolecules, genes and cells to species, community and biomes, there seem to be some consensus among scientists that the basic unit is species, and thus the term biodiversity directly means the diversity of species, both in the numbered species richness and diversity species evenness. Change in number of species historically, the temporal change, can be studied by quantifying species richness of fossil biota at various geological strata. As the rock layers are formed and deposited one above other, the oldest is usually the bottommost if these layers are not disturbed by igneous intrusions or tectonic reworking. Number of species of fossils at each of these named and time-calibrated rock layers would correspond to the level of global biodiversity when these species existed or when these rock layers were formed. Temporal change in global biodiversity has no obvious patterns. It increases and decreases in response to a wide variety of factors. A graph of such a temporal change is analogous to a stock market index. Both goes up and down in response to a complex, intertwined network of factors. The rate of biodiversity change depends on two principal factors, rate of speciation and rate of extinction. Therefore, all the factors that contribute to these two principal factors indirectly drive the global biodiversity change. As rate of speciation increases, so is the biodiversity, i.e., directly proportional, while the rate of extinction is inversely proportional to the biodiversity. 6. Paper O3 Biodiversity and Conservation. Consider an indirect factor, genetic drift. This evolutionary process is one of the principal mechanisms through which microevolution, change in allele frequencies within a population over time, works. The other mechanism is Darwinian natural selection. Genetic drift is random sampling of alleles gene variants and is especially prominent when the population size is low. The effect of genetic drift towards speciation is positive. It increases variation between populations, while decreases variation within the populations, and both of these are good for these populations to evolve into separate species. Therefore, genetic drift indirectly increases the biodiversity, as it increases the speciation. As mentioned, genetic drift depends upon the population size, or effective population size to be exact. Effective population size is the number of fertile individuals of a population, and drift becomes more rigorous when population size is low. This is especially important after catastrophic events when the population drastically decreases. For example, a major asteroid impact, or snowball Earth, when much of the Earth's surface is covered with massive ice sheets. Such events that drastically reduce the population is called population bottleneck. As drift increases speciation during population bottlenecks, an increase in biodiversity is expected after these major catastrophes. Of course, after second snowball Earth, a major, explosive, increase in global biodiversity happened approximately 540 million years ago, the so-called Cambrian explosion. After each major extinction events, global biodiversity spikes and a number of new species are populated on the planet Earth. Let us consider yet another factor, resource limitation. During the periods of global glaciation when much of the planet Earth is covered under ice sheets, resources for the sustenance of life become extremely scarce, and this drives many species go extinct. Resource limitation thus increases rate of extinction, and therefore decreases biodiversity. On a lesser scale, global biodiversity is also affected by immigration incoming and emigration outgoing of species, together called migration. However, migration causes changes in spatial patterns of biodiversity, not its temporal patterns. 7. Paper O3 Biodiversity and Conservation. 3.2. Pace of macroevolution. The major evolutionary changes that occurs at or above species level over deep geologic time period is known as macroevolution. Principal process in macroevolution is speciation, the formation of new species. As global biodiversity is directly proportional to the rate of speciation, the pace of macroevolution is one of the principal factors driving the temporal change in global biodiversity. Studying the evolution of morphological traits at specific taxa of fossils, paleontologists could trace various patterns of the pace of macroevolution. One such a pattern is directed selection gradualism, when one form gradually changes to the next form through the process of natural selection. Natural selection is the survival and reproduction of traits that confers fitness of individuals, as these traits make the individuals well adapted to the environment. In this mode, evolutionary change, or rate of mutations, occurs at a constant and even pace. This causes slow, incremental changes in species, and is depicted in a smooth tree-like fashion. Yet another mode of macroevolution is evident in a number of paleontological studies is what is called as random walk. Random walk, as in the walk of a drunkard predicting the way how drunkard would walk mathematically, is indeed called random walk theory, means traits randomly changing between two contrasting forms. For example, pelvic girdle size of a particular fish lineage. Over the course of a million years, the girdle size sometimes increases, sometimes decreases without any clear pattern or directionality. The mean pelvic girdle size would remain same. Random walks are not directional and is usually caused by genetic drift. The third mode of macroevolution is punctuated equilibrium, a now famous theory proposed by paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. In this mode, long periods of little or no evolutionary changes of traits, the stasis, follows periods of rapid phenotypical changes over a short period, the saltations. In punctuated equilibria, long. 8. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Periods of evolutionary stasis is punctuated by short periods of evolutionary saltations. The punctuated equilibrium is typically represented in a tree-like fashion as in Darwinian-directed evolution. However, the branches are not smooth but straight lines, and rapid diversification, the speciation, represented as perpendicular straight-line branches. The period of stasis where virtually no morphological changes happen could also be due to random walks. In fossil records, diversification of lineages, i.e., speciation, usually happen over relatively a very short period, narrow rock layer. This rapid diversification, saltation, often occurs immediately after a major catastrophe, during the periods of population bottlenecks. Therefore, in this mode, the major evolutionary force that drives the speciation is random genetic drift that occurs during catastrophes, not Darwinian natural selection. Comparative prevalence of these three modes in various fossil lineages had been studied in detail, and conclusion is that the Darwinian-directed selection is extremely rare, occurs less than 5% of traits. The remaining 95% of traits were divided equally between random walks and punctuated equilibria. Directed Darwinian selection was also found to be rare in a number of protein-coding genes, where the prevailing mode was neutral evolution. Japanese evolutionary biologist Moto Kimura found that most of the mutations that occurs in nature are synonymous, i.e., mutations that do not change the encoded amino acid does not confer evolutionary fitness to the individuals, and thus, they are evolutionarily neutral. Synonymous mutations are fixed in a population through the stochastic event of genetic drift. These, neutral evolution, at molecular level within microevolution, can be compared with either stasis, or random walks at macroevolutionary level. Neutral evolution has no directionality. Among the minority of non-synonymous mutations, mutations that change the encoded amino acid, that Kimura observed, he found that a vast majority of these mutations are purifying in nature, i.e., these mutations are selected by nature to get rid of deleterious mutations. This is called purifying selection. Positive, Darwinian selection, fixation of advantageous mutations, directional selection, or a rarity in DNA data, as in the case of rarity of directional selection, a rarity in the case. 9. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation of macroevolution in fossil lineages is discussed earlier. Taking together, Darwinian natural selection is now thought to be rather a minor force to shape the evolution. Most of the speciation happens after major catastrophes and are results of random genetic drift. 3.3. Ecological factors affecting temporal changes in biodiversity. As explained in the last section, temporal changes in the biodiversity is largely driven by rapid speciation immediately after major catastrophic events, the so-called saltations, as well as by extinctions. A number of ecological factors contribute in speciation as well as extinction, and therefore these factors affects the biodiversity change. Predation is one of the well-studied ecological factor, and is now considered to be a crucial factor behind Cambrian explosion. Just prior to this event, during Ediacaran period, biodiversity was comparatively scarce. At the Cambrian, however, a huge spike in marine biodiversity happened, and almost all known animal phyla of today emerged. A remarkable characteristic of several Cambrian fossils is the predatory marks on it, which are non-existent in the Ediacaran fossils. Predation increases intrapopulation competition within prey species, which lead to a higher diversification. As prey species gets better and better at avoiding the predator by swimming at higher speeds, for instance through natural selection, so as predators. This competition between predators and prey through natural selection is called evolutionary arms race, and is thought to be a major driver for the diversification of lineages. Species introductions dramatically change the ecological niche of habitats. Introduced, exotic species are often more evolutionarily fit, they outcompete the local organisms and often have no predators. Eventually these exotic species could drive the local endemic species to extinction. Species introduction also enable the introduced species to establish itself in a resource-rich habitat. This would lead founder effects and associated parapatric. 10. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Speciation within the exotic species lineage, thus driving the biodiversity up. In one study, a lizard species Anolis sagre was experimentally introduced to 14 islands in Bahama. Within next decade, each of these lineages had several unique morphological trait evolutions, the first step toward speciation. Here, selection along with adaptation to divergent habitats is the principal driving force behind the evolutionary change. Consequences of species introductions are often tremendous, affecting the entire habitat. Introduction by deep-rooted desert trees dramatically reduce the river flow, and affect almost the entire downstream riverine habitat. Invasive deep-rooted star thistles make the habitat arid by consuming large amount of water. Species invasions also result in disturbance regimes, widespread floral replacement. For example, when a grass species that are prone to fire invaded Hawaii, it increased the frequency of fire and affected the local populations of trees and shrubs. Several studies have revealed that a higher biodiversity corresponds to a higher ecosystem function. The more species richness, more will be the health and resilience of the ecosystem. A related concept is portfolio effect. Species occupying different trophic levels coexisting at a particular habitat make the biodiversity more resilient from disturbances. If this species coexistence is disturbed, for example through a species introduction, the health of the entire ecosystem is affected that might lead to species extinctions. Ecology also plays a key role in at least two modes of speciation as discussed in speciation module, parapatry and sympatry. In parapatry, population occupying at different ecological niche diversify, gets reproductively isolated and evolve into separate species. In the sympatry, speciation happen within the range of parental population through differential resource utilization, as in cichlid fishes, or through disruptive selection. A well-known example of sympatric speciation is apple maggot flies Raguletus pulmonella. The original host had been hawthorns. In 1864, these flies adopted to utilize new resource, the host apple. In 1960, yet another host adaptation to cherry happened. All these fly populations differentially adapted to these contrasting resources evolved into different races, partly. 11. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Due to differences in phenology of hosts leading to the reproductive isolation of flies. Phenology is the study of periodic plant and animal life cycle events and how these are influenced by seasonal and interannual variations in climate, as well as habitat factors such as elevation. Several recent studies have confirmed that selection caused by shifts in ecology, as well as through species invasion, plays a crucial role in speciation. 3.4. Geological biogeographical factors affecting temporal changes in biodiversity. Geology and biogeography plays a crucial role in the process of speciation and extinction, and, therefore, influence temporal patterns of global biodiversity. Life on Earth originated approximately 4 billion years ago, immediately after the formation of oceans. In this origin of life, various geological processes played its role as a crucible of life. As discussed in speciation module, reproductive isolation caused by geographical barrier, vicariance, is the major driver of allopatric speciation, the most common speciation mode. While there are no barrier involved, biogeography-mediated reproductive isolation plays major roles in parapatric speciation as well, founder effects for instance. Together, allopatry and parapatry are two of the most common speciation modes and both are under the influence of biogeography. Several types of reproductive barriers are the result of geologic processes. Continental collision leading to the orogenic uplift resulted in massive mountain ranges such as Himalayas. Formation of glaciers, rivers, lakes, land bridges, isthmus, etc., have ramifications on reproductive isolation of species. Hot springs and hydrothermal vents, the product of geological processes, create unique habitats for the evolution of various chemoautotropic and thermophilic lineages. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, among other such geological processes might create effective reproductive barriers, change species distribution patterns, or drive species to extinction. For example, a massive asteroid impact at Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico created not only Chicxulub crater, but it also drove. 12. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. A number of species to extinction, including dinosaurs, Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. Plate tectonics have changed routes of dispersal of several marine as well as terrestrial species. For example, collision of Indian plate with Eurasian plate approximately 45 million years ago resulted in the introduction of frogs, caecilians and turtle species from Africa to Eurasia, while reverse introduction of anguid lizards, iguanid lizards and void snakes from Eurasia into India. After the formation of Isthmus of Panama, invasion of ungulate animals from North America to South America quickly replaced the native ungulate species, and this caused extinction of several lineages. In addition, the role of geology in the development of several landscapes and biomes are unequivocal. Geology of the underlying rock influences the type of soil and substratum for the development of biota. Global climate is an important determinant for the temporal changes in biodiversity, and is being influenced by a large number of factors, perhaps the most prominent one being Milankovitch-CH cycles, 3 astronomical attributes causing systematic changes in the distance and orientation of Earth relative to the Sun. Precession is a change in the orientation of the rotational axis of a rotating body. Earth's precession happens once in 26,000 years. Axial tilt, also known as obliquity of the ecliptic, is the angle between an object's rotational axis and its orbital axis, or, equivalently, the angle between its equatorial plane and orbital plane. Earth's axial tilt changes once in 41,000 years. The orbital eccentricity of an astronomical object is a parameter that determines the amount by which its orbit around another body deviates from a perfect circle. A value of 0 is a circular orbit. Values between 0 and 1 form an elliptical orbit. 1 is a parabolic escape orbit, and greater than 1 is a hyperbola. Earth's orbital eccentricity changes once in 100,000 years. These 3 factors are thought to account for glacial cycles, and thereby the global biodiversity. 13. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. 4. Summary. 4.1. 2 principal factors controlling temporal changes in global biodiversity are rate of speciation and rate of extinction. 4.2. Rates of speciation and extinctions are controlled by complex, intertwined network of factors comprising of both biotic as well as abiotic elements. 4.3. The pace of macroevolution is a determinant of biodiversity change. 3 principal modes are directed Darwinian evolution, random walk and punctuated equilibrium. Combined modes of random walk and punctuated equilibrium are responsible for approximately 95% of trait evolution. 4.4. Evidence from DNA data also corroborate that most of the speciation happens immediately after population bottleneck situations caused by major catastrophes. 4.5. A number of ecological factors contribute in temporal changes in global biodiversity, including predation, disturbance regime, species introduction and species coexistence. Examples of ecology-mediated speciation modes are parapatry and sympatry. 4.6. A number of geological and biogeographical factors also contribute in temporal changes in global biodiversity. The origin of life on planet Earth was driven by geologic processes. Global climate is principally determined by three components of Milankovitch cycles. A number of geologic processes create effective reproductive isolation by variance, resulting in allopatric speciation. Plate tectonics results in species introductions en masse, leading to profound changes in biodiversity of both the plates. Paper 7. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. 3.2. Pace of macroevolution. The major evolutionary changes that occurs at or above species level over deep geologic time period is known as macroevolution. Principal process in macroevolution is speciation, the formation of new species. As global biodiversity is directly proportional to the rate of speciation, the pace of macroevolution is one of the principal factors driving the temporal change in global biodiversity. Studying the evolution of morphological traits at specific taxa of fossils, paleontologists could trace various patterns of the pace of macroevolution. One such a pattern is directed selection gradualism, when one form gradually changes to the next form through the process of natural selection. Natural selection is the survival and reproduction of traits that confers fitness of individuals, as these traits make the individuals well adapted to the environment. In this mode, evolutionary change, or rate of mutations, occurs at a constant and even pace. This causes slow, incremental changes in species, and is depicted in a smooth tree-like fashion. Yet another mode of macroevolution is evident in a number of paleontological studies is what is called as random walk. Random walk, as in the walk of a drunkard predicting the way how drunkard would walk mathematically, is indeed called random walk theory, means traits randomly changing between two contrasting forms. For example, pelvic girdle size of a particular fish lineage. Over the course of a million years, the girdle size sometimes increases, sometimes decreases without any clear pattern or directionality. The mean pelvic girdle size would remain same. Random walks are not directional and is usually caused by genetic drift. The third mode of macroevolution is punctuated equilibrium, a now famous theory proposed by paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. In this mode, long periods of little or no evolutionary changes of traits, the stasis, follows periods of rapid phenotypical changes over a short period, the saltations. Introduction. Variability in the species composition of plants, animals and microorganisms on Earth is imperative for the sustenance of healthy, balanced and thriving ecosystems. However, growth of human population and rising consumption levels are disturbing the biodiversity components, ecosystem integrity and sustainable use of ecosystem services. Complex interactions of various demographic, socio-economic, cultural and technological factors have created a chain of unnatural anthropogenic activities ending up with irreversible loss of various plant and animal species. The major drivers of biodiversity loss such as habitat degradation and fragmentation, invasion by alien species, enhanced population, pollution, and exploitation levels and anthropogenic climate change are being discussed in this chapter. Statistics of biodiversity loss. A WWF report suggests that 52% of the world's biodiversity, including terrestrial, freshwater and marine diversity, has been lost in a 40-year span between 1970 and 2010, freshwater diversity being affected most. IUCN has stated that 75% of the genetic diversity of agricultural crops, 75% of the fisheries stock and one-third of the reef-building corals around the globe are either threatened or lost. 42% of the amphibians, 25% of mammals and 19% of the reptile species among the faunal species, whereas 71% of magnolias, 63% of cycads and 34% of conifers among the floral species are categorized as threatened with extinction. Other estimates suggest that current rate of species extinction is estimated to be as rapid as 1,000 and 10,000 times as compared to the average rate during last few billion years. In fact, the sixth major extinction would be the greatest event in past 65 million years since the disappearance of dinosaurs. Some studies also suggest that within next 2 to 300 years, half of the mammal and bird species worldwide may become extinct. However, statistics of biodiversity loss. What types of species is most vulnerable to extinction? Major threats to the biodiversity. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Quantifying the rate of extinction is difficult as the total biodiversity on Earth is yet to be discovered and the biodiversity monitoring is insufficient. Quantifying the rate of extinction is difficult as the total biodiversity on Earth is yet to be discovered and the biodiversity monitoring is insufficient. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. What types of species is most vulnerable to extinction? Rare species as listed by IUCN. Species with restricted geographical range, such as the organisms dwelling on the island ecosystems. Species occurring at the sites of high human disturbance exploitation. Species with large, specialized, stable habitat requirements. Species with slow reproductive rate. Plants with ineffective dispersal ability. Species being heavily predated. Seasonal migrants. Species with lesser genetic variability. Species with no prior contact with humans. Species closely related to the extinct or threatened species. Major threats to the biodiversity of habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation. Any sort of change incurred by natural or anthropogenic activities in the local environmental conditions may pose a threat to the plant-animal microbial diversity sustaining there. In fact, the habitat degradation and fragmentation, caused by human-induced land use changes, is the main factor driving biodiversity loss. Human interference in the natural self-sustaining ecosystems have shrunk the habitats of different plant and animal species and limited the supply of resources essential for their survival. Activities such as urbanization, expansion of agricultural lands, industrialization, deforestation, mining, damming and dredging of rivers, and draining of wetlands, estuaries and mangroves are majorly responsible for turning a habitat unsuitable for the local species. Terrestrial ecosystems. Deforestation is one of the direct causes of species extinction in the terrestrial ecosystems. Forest ecosystems bears a major portion of the world's terrestrial biodiversity provides. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Innumerable ecosystem services and play a critical role in the operation of global biogeochemical cycles. However, forest lands are being cleared up for the expansion of agricultural fields, residential areas, and industries and for obtaining fuel, fodder, furniture, raw material for paper and pulp industry, medicinal plants, and precious herbs, thereby destroying the most dependable ecosystems on Earth. Tropical rainforests are known to withhold the highest percentage of the world's flora and fauna. However, these biomes have been highly disturbed as a result of massive destruction of forests and its conversion into other land uses. Habitat fragmentation, splitting of large units of habitat into smaller parts, in the Amazon rainforests has resulted in the significant biodiversity loss. If the next 30 years would experience a similar deforestation rate as now, 5 to 10% of the species would be at the verge of extinction due to habitat loss. This indicates the strong need of sustainable forest practices. But in the view of increasing demands that are estimated to be doubled over next 50 years, it is difficult to control the rate of destruction of forests. Desertification is another reason of habitat loss, driven by the similar reasons as that of deforestation, such as extension of agricultural processes, urbanization, industrialization and overexploitation. Poor land management, further provoked by global warming and climatic change, has degraded the organic content, fertility, and water-retaining abilities of the soil, converting them into deserts. The 25 to 40% decline in soil organic content has been observed over past 25 years. The desertification not only makes a land unsuitable for human usage but also leave the local plant and animal species homeless. Marine ecosystems. Occupying the 70% of Earth's total surface, oceans are considered as the largest ecosystems regulating the global climate, biogeochemical cycles, a high percentage of world's food production and various other economic aspects. Constant degradation of coastal and marine environment due to rising fishery trade, overexploitation of resources, rising pollution, poor nearshore land use practices, discharge of industrial wastes, etc. have reduced the fisheries production and threatened the aquatic biodiversity. On the other hand, coral reefs, another important and diverse ecosystem, are experiencing a high level of exploitation and pollution. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. The rising levels of water in the oceans have shrunk island ecosystems, disturbing the flora and fauna sustaining there. B. Invasive species. When any organism is migrated to a new geographical area, there is a chance that the alien species may become invasive and can affect the native species in several different ways. It can parasitize or predate upon resident species, compete for the resources, bring unfamiliar diseases, modify habitats and ecological conditions, disrupt the existing food web, hinder the environmental interactions and threaten endemic species. The invasive alien species can directly replace the native species through completion, predation or allelopathy, or it may transform the structure and composition of ecosystem, thereby indirectly repressing or excluding the native species. Recently, the rate and risk associated with the introduction of alien species have escalated significantly because of the rising human population, increased travel, trade and tourism, climate change, and habitat fragmentation. The invasive alien species (IAS) are considered as the second leading cause of biodiversity loss after habitat destruction and the major cause of species extinction in most island ecosystems. The invasive species may be introduced intentionally by humans for hybridization, cultivation, ornamental purposes, or it may get migrated accidentally along with the goods being exchanged between the countries or through the people traveling across the world, or via long-distance dispersal as in case of plants. In marine ecosystems, the introduction of alien species can result from hull fouling, ballast water from ships, or through aquaculture and aquarium releases. Such introductions are as old as the history of human migration to different parts of the world, but in the recent past, particularly since the 17th century, introduction of invasive alien species have become more and more frequent and resulted in nearly 40% of all the animal extinctions. Similarly, nearly 300 species of crustaceans, mollusks and fishes have entered the Mediterranean Sea from the Red Sea through the Suez Canal since 1891 that have now dominated over the native species. In the Fynbos biome of South Africa, 80% of the threatened species are endangered because of invading alien species. Many countries have established systems to prevent and control the Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Migration of alien species, to predict the likelihood of alien species becoming invasive and the potential ecological and economic cost they may incur. To effectively combat the challenges posed by invasive alien species, there is a need for global networking and communication at different levels. C. Pollution. Different pollutants entering our environment via release of excessive amounts of nitrates, phosphates from agricultural runoff, emission of greenhouse gases through deforestation and burning of fossil fuels, dumping of sewage into the water bodies, etc. has severely influenced the natural ecosystems of Earth. Pollution may not be directly responsible for extinction, but it disrupts the habitat conditions of an organism. Persistent organic pollutants, drugs, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, acid rain, heavy metals, and plastics, etc. can cause environmental toxicity, and since it is difficult for the organisms to reside in the modified surroundings, they are either forced to migrate or adjust. As a result, the species that could not cope up with the changing environment generally dies out. For example, acid rain can alter the pH of the soil and water bodies, thereby affecting the feeding options, breeding conditions, and species composition of the locale. Poisonous gases present in the atmosphere may cause allergies, respiratory problems, and fatal diseases in many species. Nitrates and phosphates released from the fertilizers run off from the fields into the water system and can cause non-habitable zones for the freshwater animals and plants known as dead zones. Plastics, oil and waste disposed in the rivers, lakes and oceans make it difficult for the fishes and seabirds to survive. Similarly, bioaccumulation is another example in which the top carnivores suffer high toxicity due to the multiplication of heavy metal concentrations through the food chain as seen in killer whales. D. Human population and overexploitation. With an exponential increase in human population around the globe in last few decades, the pressures on biodiversity have significantly enhanced. Increasing population has resulted in excess demand of resources generally accomplished by the unhealthy practices such as Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Poaching, targeted hunting, overfishing and overharvesting. This has led to the killing of numerous species over the past few decades, resulting in great loss of biodiversity. Fisheries have been the most vulnerable group in terms of overexploitation, especially after World War II because of technological developments like refrigeration, sonar, larger nets, and onboard processing. According to IUCN, overfishing has reduced commercial fish stocks by 90% in the last several years. The cod fishery in the northwestern Atlantic Ocean has witnessed a population collapse due to intense harvesting. On the other hand, overhunting and poaching of the top predators of the food chain resulted in the disruption of the entire food web. The megafauna extinction, caused due to overharvesting, is one such major example. E. Climate change. Climate plays a crucial role in deciding the distribution of species across the globe. Climate change has therefore influenced the composition of flora and fauna, particularly the keystone species, thus disturbing the entire ecosystem. Increase in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, particularly the CO2, affects the physiological functioning of plants. Being primary producers, any change in the plant community of an area directly or indirectly influences the secondary or tertiary consumers dependent on them. As climate warms, species thriving in the plain areas will migrate towards higher altitudes, whereas the temperate species will be threatened. It may also result in phenological changes among insects, birds, plants and mammals. Change in the life cycle patterns has already been evidenced in certain migratory birds and insects. Disturbed weather situations may result in behavioral changes in pollinators, pests and pathogens, thereby disturbing the delicate balance that exists in the wild. Rising ocean temperatures and diminishing Arctic sea ice can shift vegetation zones, significantly affecting the marine biodiversity. A report from Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) estimates that 20–30% of plant and animal species are likely to be at increased risk of extinction if greenhouse gas emissions continued at the current rate. Climate change may also promote distribution and abundance of invasive species, thus indirectly promoting a threat to biodiversity. Small and fragmented ecosystems such as islands, coral reefs, mangrove swamps and coastal wetlands are more vulnerable to the Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Changes in temperature as compared to the large ecosystems. With further shifts in climatic conditions, biodiversity will face more severe threats. Some other factors that could be held responsible for wiping out any taxon includes epidemics, warfare, and UV radiation penetrating on Earth due to depletion of ozone layer, considered a primary threat to amphibians. Table 1 Threats in terrestrial ecosystems and their underlying causes. Threats to biodiversity. In terrestrial ecosystems. Underlying causes. Habitat degradation and fragmentation. Deforestation, urbanization, industrialization, expansion of agricultural lands and extension of road network, invasion in wild areas for recreation and tourism. Dynamic relationship between agriculture and wildlife. Modernization of agricultural practices and disappearance of natural hosts of wildlife such as hedges, trees, ponds, etc. Pollution. Population explosion, industrialization, increased number of vehicles, use of excessive fertilizers in agricultural practices, unhealthy waste management techniques, etc. Invasions by alien species. International trade and transport, use of exotic plant species in gardening and forestry, introduction of exotic species for hybridization, climate change. Epidemics, introduction of exotic pests, pollution and habitat destruction, climate change. Emissions of greenhouse gases, deforestation and other land use changes due to human activities. Desiccation of soils and wetlands. Overuse of underground water tables. Paper 03 Biodiversity and Conservation. Table 2 Threats in marine ecosystems and their underlying causes. Threats to biodiversity in marine freshwater ecosystems. Underlying causes. Overfishing. Rising human population, increased demand in industrial sector, lack of strict laws by catch species. Pollution and eutrophication. Industrial pollutants dumped into water bodies, runoff from agricultural fields, sewage disposal in rivers, lakes. Degradation of the sea floor, beam trawling, dredging, sand and gravel extraction, invasions by alien species. Tourism and maritime trade, ballast waters, fouling, navigation for recreation, mariculture, climate change. Other anthropogenic disturbances. Coastal development, recreation and leisure, deteriorating water quality in oceans, mechanical beach cleaning, water pollution, noise pollution. Conclusion. It can be concluded from Table 1 and 2 that every factor considered responsible for biodiversity loss is interlinked and generally promote each another. Since all these factors have been operating in the environment altogether, the synergistic threats to the biodiversity are possibly much more severe than we can quantify. Since all these factors have been operating in the environment altogether, the synergistic threats to the biodiversity are possibly much more severe than we can quantify or estimate. The pressures built on biodiversity are mainly driven by economic development and increasing demand for the biological resources. It is important to understand that loss of biodiversity will result in lack of genetic stocks and ecosystem services, thereby jeopardizing the economic development. Decreased biodiversity may also interfere with essential ecological processes such as pollination, maintenance of soil fertility, flood controls, water purification, assimilation of wastes and the cycling of carbon and other nutrients. Mitigation efforts are therefore needed to be put forward to conserve biodiversity.